All right, so we're going to examine some of the pro arguments, right, that we've seen from this now. And again, I think it's important that we start here with the understanding that if there is going to be any pro argument made for it, for me, I think it's best to start the idea of saying that it ought to be illegal until one is 25 there, or it shouldn't be used until one is 25.
You said 25?
Yeah, so I say that term specifically, or that number specifically, because the studies of science have shown that it can have negative impacts on developing brains, right? And so we know that your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that is responsible for making good decisions, right?
Judgment.
Judgment-based decisions is not fully formed until roughly about 25 years old. And so that to me is an important starter here because we have something that's clear and concise in terms of an evidentiary model showing that it's problematic anytime before then. And so I think when we kind of frame it in that kind of contextualization and understanding, it's a little bit of an easier way to kind of begin moving the dialogue forward.
Okay.
And so, and then when we begin to examine even like the medical benefits of marijuana for people who have like chronic pain disorders, I think the assessment here is kind of obvious. Christians are called to have compassion on people in a plant that is regulated well and not abused by a patient. You know, if somebody's going through some type of terminal cancer or has some type of autoimmune disease, you know, for which they have, you know, a lot of pain, like a fibromyalgia kind of situation, and the SSIDs that, you know, have tough side effects that maybe that come with, you know, fibromyalgia, like depression and anxiety and stuff like that, that have worse side effects than the actual things themselves. Weed can be a real answer to that kind of conversation. And so there's value in at least having the discussion about its legitimacy as a legitimate pharmaceutical option or alternative to like opiates or painkillers or, you know, other SSID inhibitors and things like that. From a biblical perspective, specifically on this one, right, Christian morality shows us that followers are to take an active role in caring for the sick. And in Jesus' conversation in Matthew 25, one of the criteria that he talks about for entrance into the kingdom of heaven is like, what kind of compassion did you have on people who were sick? And so if there is something like weed that can fit into the conversation of like bringing legitimate pain relief and healing, then maybe that can fit into that that part of the that dialogue there.
Interesting.
What do you think?
So does that stand over and against recreational use for you?
I don't know. I think if somebody's making a pro argument for the side, I think it's probably two parallel conversations that are happening at the same time, right? Because I know anxiety is a disorder that is becoming far too common in the United States, right? With people who are in the millennial range, like kind of where we sit. And so the idea here would be like, how are we defining specifically medicinal versus recreational? Because people who use it recreationally might say like, well, I'm still using it for medicinal purposes, right? So I have good friends who I know who use weed, who I would say probably abuse weed actually, but they would say that, well, I'm using it to go to sleep or I'm using it to help calm my nerves, right? It's like instead of drinking a beer after work or having a glass of red wine, right? It's like I smoke a blunt and it actually helps me relax and feel better.
Yeah,
So
that's interesting. So there's a lot of, it's subjective by nature, right? In terms of discerning both intention and the self-awareness of that process. Do you think that the legalization or the way that people get access to it and the way that it would work in economic system in its implementation in society, how would it be able to filter through those things?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. Kind of the economic conversation is pretty important because I think it speaks to the larger discussion in general. The idea of abuse of something because it becomes legalized is certainly a thing that has to be watched for and watched closely. But we see Paul even encouraging Timothy, right, about the idea of using a potentially abusable substance
that's
to help
an interesting
quell,
verse, right?
The pain in his stomach. And so we'll come back to this later in the conversation. I think your point about like discerning the heart motive behind things is incredibly important to this conversation there. But specifically on the recreational side, my argument doesn't, or my thought process, I guess, doesn't really stem so much from the notion of like unwinding after work, right, for the sake of unwinding after work. I don't.
Okay.
I think that's a little bit narrow or short-sighted in the bigger discussion about what the historicity of marijuana has been in this country, and more than that, I think the bigger conversation that we ought to at least be aware of as Christians when we're going to consider the totality of the picture. Because if we're not careful, we can end up actually contributing to and making problematic more instances of this moving forward. And so here's what I mean by that, right? We understand that there's kind of been this big realization in America recently that the drug war has been used to target minority communities, and pretty unsuccessfully at that in terms of like stopping crime or making stuff, less bad in urban areas or whatever. And I mean, much to the effect of like Oregon in this last year's election cycle went forward and started just saying, all right, we're just going to decriminalize drugs in general.
Wholesale.
Like full hog on something like that, which is a whole nother conversation, right? For a different kind of day. But we understand that, even from the first part of the 1900s or the early part of the 20th century, weed was a controlled substance that people could buy over the counter, right? Yeah. And when it was made illegal in 1930-ish, right, it was kind of described as like this south of the border thing, like a jazz cigarette, like that was going to make things worse for the world. And it was quite literally brought up by Mexican people to like wreak havoc on culture.
And to corrupt the youth.
Yes, and to make America awful and blah, blah, blah. And so the illegality of weed is rooted in this idea of like racism, cynicism towards the other, xenophobia, like real, genuine systemic injustice. And I think that's an important part to consider, because if we're going to make something illegal or legal, we have to understand the history behind the conversation, because what are we supporting inadvertently, in that whole topic and in that whole conversation. And so we see, again, because justice is one of the main jobs of a follower of Jesus, right? Our job is to be just people. Now, it doesn't mean if you vote or think weed should be illegal, it doesn't mean you're like an unjust person. That's not what I'm saying, right? But the picture of justice is one that is focused on understanding the holistic context, right? Like the totality of a situation. And those roles that those things play, right, in terms of the racial historicity of all of that, make a difficult conversation, or at least make the conversation more cloudy, right, when we're having this discussion. Somebody who's arguing for weed would say. There's an author here, his name's John Hudak, in his book Marijuana, A Short Story. He does a great job of kind of exploring the explicitly racist roots of cannabis policy in the United States. He highlights, how politicians across the political spectrum use marijuana as a means of trying to keep America divided, right, intentionally, from the way they classified it as a Schedule 1 drug or Tier 1 drug, right? So he writes specifically, they painted the drug as a scourge from the south of the border to a jazz drug to the corruptive intoxicant of choice for beatniks and hippies. Marijuana as a drug and the laws sought to control it played on some of America's worst tendencies around race, ethnicity, civil disobedience, and otherness. And I think that otherness is what's particularly important to me, because as followers of Christ, the idea here is like we're supposed to embrace the other. Now, does this mean that we have to legalize marijuana to do that? I don't know. I don't necessarily think those two things are, coordinated hand in hand. But I think it's certainly something that we should be having a little bit more of a 30,000-foot conversation or 30,000-foot view conversation about than simply getting stuck in like, well, if I toke something in my garage, am I going to go to hell? Right? I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that.
That is nuts to me. It is so counterintuitive. Because I've never actually heard a proposition for the case to be made for a consideration for the legalization of weed from an actual grand perspective, where say, hey, you could actually be doing more good in terms of reconciliation, or changing the oppressiveness or the abuse that's been happening towards people, or changing the tide of that, right? You could actually contribute to reversing that through the legalization of this.
Yeah, and the legalization factor, I mean, it does things like get people out of prison, right? It helps empty things, it reconciles families together. Yeah, and so there are very pragmatic, intentional effects that are had on communities of color who have been adversely affected by this. When we know that the rates of usage between whites and non-whites is relatively similar, but non-whites are more, it's like 4-to-1 difference in terms of more likely to get arrested for having possession, right? And so it's like there's a clear systemic injustice that's kind of rooted at the heart of this conversation. And I think it's at least important to recognize, because as Christians who live in a expressly non-Christian society, what's the best way that we can react to this kind of conversation while saying it's like, if people who are going to use it, they're going to use it anyway. So if you legalize something, you can tax it, you can generate more revenue, you can help entrepreneurial type, endeavors ensue for communities of color, for people who've been adversely affected. You can take real intentional and actionable steps as a non-Christian government to help people flourish and get into places of life where their physical needs are met, and then you can walk alongside people in life and then begin to meet spiritual needs. Now, the caveat to that is people will just say, hey man, you're just trying to like Jesus it up so you can go get high. And to be fair,
sprinkles on the...
And to be totally fair, that's a good, that's a real critique because people will abuse that.
Right.
And so we have to be very careful about kind of understanding that it certainly cuts both ways.
Absolutely fascinating to me.